Welcome again, my Varieties 4 students. This is another session of Varieties 4. Today we'll be introduced to a new level of stylistic analysis in literary text, which is vocabulary. And as you already know, wording or diction are vital and crucial in the instruction and construction of any literary work. In fact, there are numerous lexical features which should be taken into account while performing stylistic analysis. All right. So these stylistic or lexical features, such as synonyms, lexical sets, the scale of formality, repetitions, and also all those figures of rhetoric that are widely recurrent and used among authors and writers of literature. We will also pay a special focus on deviant vocabulary or deviant use of wording and morphology, where writers and authors deliberately deviate certain words, sometimes by creating new forms or new words in the text. In fact, deviation and foregrounding are two important aspects in the field of stylistics that should always be taken into consideration while doing the analysis, because we always shed light on deviant forms of language use, and they are always actually used for foregrounding sake. So, and also they are done for prominence sake as well, because they are important in the context and important to the text itself. So they always reflect a kind of beauty, novelty to the language. So let's move to our outline. So let's start with vocabulary. Remember that vocabulary is a one level of stylistic analysis, and it includes the study of individual words as well as idioms and expressions entailed in the text. And within the paradigm of vocabulary, we look at the literary devices and techniques employed and exploited by the author, such as figures of speech, including metaphor, simile, personification, hyperbole, and so on. These written strategies of text do not just ornament it, but it also broaden it in terms of implications, and opens more doors for interpretations. So let's go back to our slide. The most important part of literary language is vocabulary. There are numerous lexical features which are stylistically marked and worth discussing. Number one, synonyms. Synonyms are words similar or close in meaning, but in my opinion, they are never identical. Okay, maybe we can find two words that are very similar in meaning, very close, but we cannot have 100% identical word, okay, like very similar, exactly the same meaning. This is impossible. Anyway, so this is the general definition for a synonym: words similar or close in meaning. These are some examples that illustrate synonyms, like cry and weep, happy and ecstatic, vast and colossal. I'm sure like you know all these ABCs of of lexical features. Anyway, synonyms are equally used in narratives and poetry. So they are really used in because they enhance meaning and they make it very condensed. So the stylistic function of using synonyms is given meaning, tense connotations, and greater dimensions, and to enrich the text implications as well as interpretations. So synonyms are used as a writing technique that can help deepen the text and giving it more meaning, and so this makes it really rich, and it also gives more implications to the text. Another vital feature related to vocabulary is lexical sets or lexical family. Words that belong to the same family, for example, as we have in Deacon's text: machinery, chimneys, buildings, smokes, pavements, rattling, black streets, smelling gray, and so on. These are all words, if you look at them, they all refer to city life. Okay, so we say that all these words belong to the same lexical set, or they belong to the same lexical family. So all these words suggest city life with its loud, dull, colorless atmosphere, and so they are said to belong to the same family. Lexical sets can help you understand more about a setting, characters, feelings. Examining lexical sets is a key to understanding the tone and mood of any work of literature. Okay, so you can make lexical sets of verbs, and you look at these verbs. Do these verbs, for example, hint at something happy or sad? You can also use it for nouns. Do these nouns refer to something? Okay, do they refer to, for example, words related to workplace? Are they referring to words related to city life or anything else? So when you analyze any text, pay attention to how words are linked and belonged to the same semantic family. One more stylistic feature is lexical repetitions, or the repetitions of some words and phrases or sometimes expressions throughout a text. So the repetition of certain words, vocabulary, or phrases is not done innocently. It is done deliberately, and there is a message hidden behind this kind of repetitions. The repetitions of certain words several times successively or sporadically throughout a literary work is of supreme importance, because it always hints at something that is important to the plot or to the text or to the author. Its function can be essential to understanding the message of the literary work. Dickens, for example, in his text contains many examples of lexical repetitions. For example, he repeated many times the word or the color red brick, red. Okay, and this suggests that Cocktown is all in all red brick and nothing else in it. All right, so the repetition usually helps to intensify the message. Okay, so the example here, the excessive use of the word red and the brick now gives and helps the reader to depict a mental picture of how Cocktown once was all in red brick, so it was all red. One important image that Dickens throughout the text tried his hard to intensify it to the reader is the sameness of the city of Cocktown, including its people. So like one another is repeated so many times in the text. So the things and the people of Cocktown are like one another. Nothing is different or special about them. All right. So they are all indifferent. They are all the same. They are all ruled by means of conformity. Okay. There is nothing special or distinctive about the city or its people. Another phrase that is repeatedly um, used is the same, just like one another. Sameness, this important concept of sameness in Cocktown City. So the same, everything is the same. Time, sounds, pavements, work, days, and everything else. No change, no novelty, nothing refreshing or revitalizing. So the sameness of everything reflects the depth of the town. The town is completely devoid of spirit. All right, and so this was excellently expressed by Dickens through the technique of repetition, repetition, repetition. So here is one more important and really brilliant example of repetition of the word fact. Fact, fact everywhere. Fact, fact, fact everywhere. So everything is the same like everything else. The town is stagnant, monotonous, changeable, and dead. And this is a fact to Cocktown and to the city. So these adjectives of unchangeability and um, you know uh, and regularity at the city. So the city is completely tedious, boring, dull, and interesting. It's very repetitive and completely um, featureless and dreary. Now, if we are to answer this question, how does Dickens show the monotony of the workers' lives? We can simply answer that Dickens shows the monotony of the workers' lives by the successive repetition of specific words, such as the same, like one another, counterpart, and fact, and also by describing the public buildings such as the infirmary, the jail, or the town hall, that they all looked the same and could be mistaken for each other. The word fact, for example, is repeated over and over to show that the world of Cocktown is very material and mundane. Now, this suggests that spiritual and emotional side of life is completely absent and doesn't basically exist in Cocktown. This is simply how stylistic devices work. They can impact the text in terms of implications and interpretations. Unlike synonyms, antonyms refer to words opposite in meaning, for example, bad and good. One level of antonym is paradox. It is the relationship between two opposite words describing the same noun. This kind of form is deployed in literary text. It adds twist to meaning and more depth to implications. For example, when someone says, I'm sad and happy, this might not seem rational, but this kind of language is used like in poetry and in literary text in general. Okay, so I am sad and happy. You feel like there is a paradox in the statement between sad and happy, which are two contrary emotions coexisting within the same person. Now, we call this a paradoxical relationship. Sometimes you'll hate and love something, okay? So, when you are in a state where you like and hate something, then you are in a paradoxical state. A famous example of paradox is in William Shakespeare's famous play Hamlet. The protagonist Hamlet says, I must be cruel to be kind. Now, this seems to be a seemingly absurd or a self-contradictory statement or proposition that, when investigated or explained by the speaker, may prove to be well-founded or true. One more example is the paradox of war is that you have to kill people in order to stop people from killing each other. Now, this sentence also seems absurd, inconsistent, but when you try to look at this sentence from a different perspective, you may find it sensible and also logic. So we may actually assume that paradox is a powerful linguistic tool that, when used by authors or poets, gives meaning, deep dimensions, and connotations to this statement. Okay, so under the heading of figures of rhetoric, we will look at some of the commonly used figures of rhetoric. Of course, there are hundreds, but we will not look at them all, but we will look at only those that are cited in the course textbook. A figure of speech is a phrase or word having different meanings than its literal meanings. A figure of speech is used to add richness, depth to the literal meaning of words. For example, he runs very fast, or he runs like the wind. Okay, now these words maybe have the same meaning, but of course they are different in terms of their implications on the listener or on the reader. And of course, one of them is more beautiful as a sentence than the other. So that's why rhetoric or rhetorics is the most distinguishing characteristics of literary language. Rhetorical figures of all kinds are used extensively and widely, and of course, they are the flavors of any literary work. They are overloaded with meanings, connotations, and aesthetics. Now, the first rhetoric of speech to look at is simile. Simile generally is a figure of speech that directly compares two unlike things. And to make the comparison, similes often use the connecting words like or as. Okay? As we have an example here from Dickens' text, it was a town of a natural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. So here, Dickens brilliantly draws this kind of comparison by means of a simile to the town that is unnatural red and black, the red that is stained by the black of the smokes coming out of the chimneys and coming out of the factories. So the city has become ugly in red and the black, just like the painted face of a savage. Now you see how negative the image here is, and you see how ugly the image is. Okay, so we can already feel this ugliness, the savagery, this world of yes, this world of savagery, barbarity, wilderness, and cruelty. This is all reflected in his simile or in his comparison here. Now, if you want to look at examples from English literature of similes, you're gonna find not thousands but millions of examples. Okay, so they are very commonly used as a rhetoric of speech. Second, metaphor. Metaphor is a figure of speech that is used to make a comparison between two things that aren't alike on the surface but do have something in common. Um, Metaphors are the cornerstone of rhetoric, and the best examples are mostly found in poetry. For example, let's look at this example from Dickens' passage, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trail themselves forever and ever and never got uncoiled. Now the lines of smoke have the shape of coiled serpents. It is an expressive metaphor laden with implications which enlighten the message of the text. Snakes are not only famous for their coiling but also for their poisonous, deadly bites. And this entails the fear and the ugliness which applies to the town of Cocktown. Alright, so metaphors are very much important and they add meaning to the language. Now, if I give some examples of metaphor, like when I say, for example, my friend is a Shakespeare in English class. Okay, so that means my friend is not the real Shakespeare. He's not Shakespeare, of course, now, but he is his knowledge and his talent, his skills in literature are similar to those of course, this is an exaggerating kind of statement, but here we have a comparison drawn between a person and Shakespeare. Okay, and what does Shakespeare famous for? What is he famous for? He's famous for being of course, very powerful in literature. Another famous example of metaphor is Shakespeare's famous quote, "All the world is stage and all the men and women are merely players." In this metaphor, we can see that Shakespeare is comparing the world to a stage and men and women to players or actors. Notice how Shakespeare is not using the word as or like anywhere in these two lines. Okay, so this is another famous metaphor line from English literature. Another speech device that is highly preferable and also highly consumed by authors and poets is metonymy. Metonymy, simply put, is a figure of speech that uses one object in place of another related in concept. For example, using the throne or the crown to refer to the monarchy. So you use one word that can be substituted with another because it is in somehow related in concept. Look at this example. The fact is the crown must win, must always win. Okay, this is taken from Queen Mary, the crown. So here the crown, okay, doesn't represent the physical crown, but it represents the monarchy. All right. In fact, I have assembled some examples from external resources to illustrate each device with a real example, so you can understand the device in practice. I'm quite sure that you all have already some sort of idea or some background, or you know some, if not all, of the devices that we are covering today. So, because as you probably have studied them in your previous literary classes. So let's go back. So the crown here stands for the monarchy, or for the queen. All right. So as the example of, for example, the White House, when you listen to the news, then they seldom like say the American government, or no, the White House decides, for example, not to withdraw troops from Asia. So the White House, it means that the president doesn't didn't make or make a decision to withdraw his troops, or that the government did not agree on this matter. So we simply say the White House. The White House represents the American government, or represents the president. Hyperbole is another figure of speech, and it is an exaggerated statement that emphasizes a point, and sometimes it tends toward the ridiculous or the funny. Alright, so it is an over exaggeration or overstatement in literary work to function as a means of sharpening the effect of emphasis of a statement. For example, interminable serpents of smoke trail themselves forever and ever and never got uncoiled. Now, this use of ever and never, is an overstatement functioning as a strong emphasis on the whole image. Okay, so this is a very strong image depicted by Dickens in his work. So ever and never. Now this is a kind of an exaggerated statement. So we call this hyperbole. Colloquial versus formal vocabulary. Literary language is formal in nature, or even frozen formal, especially poetry, as it reflects the formality and sublimity of literary style. However, colloquial uses like contractions, incomplete sentences or fragments, phrasal verbs, dialectal words are possible in conversations that reflect characters' background. Okay, so they might be used only to reflect characters' background. Archaisms refer to outmoded or no longer used words, phrases, or expressions. Words that are so old and they are no longer used in modern language or in standard English. Now, some genres of poetry, they use archaic words, but in narrative it's quite rare, really scarce and seldom. So, but this can be used anyways. It's possible to find a work of art where there are some archaic words, and when they are exploited, then they reflect a kind of conservatism, traditionality, or formality of the work. All right. Now, in spiritual chronicles or in spiritual poetry, some authors or some poets, they use archaic words because it reflects a kind of, conservatism to the work. So these can be used as well. Neologisms. In fact, one of the main sources of new words in English is literature. Thanks to many writers such as Dickens, Joyce, Shakespeare, Milton, Spencer, they have supplemented the English language with word stock and with newly invented words that have become, by the course of time, established in the English language dictionary. Uh, Quite a number of well established English words originated in poetry, like, for example, blatant by Spencer, which means loud and wild. Another one, assassination, and pandemonia or forsuffer. Neologism reflect the dynamic and living nature of literature. It is based on novelty and creativity. Okay, now we move to a very crucial feature of stylistic analysis, which is deviant vocabulary. Deviant words are words which do not abide by the normal rules of the English language. In principle, any noun or any verb or any combination of words in English or in language can be used deviantly in literature. How is that? In fact, linguistic deviation arises or happens when the writer or the poet chooses not to abide by the rules of the language. Okay, so they would, exceed the limits of the linguistic protocols that characterize it. In other words, deviation is the breaking of rules and norms which others obey. Okay? So why do you do this? Because writers use language at will. They are somehow licensed to do with words whatever they find convenient to accommodate the message they desire to convey to the public. What's the function of deviancy or deviations? The function of literary deviation is to create more emphatic effect and heighten literary language, giving it a speciality that distinguishes it from other types of language. In fact, the use of deviant forms of language, of phrases, of sentences, it's this what gives a twist and zest to the language of literature. And this is why this type of text, that is literary text, are very common and popular because of all these features of deviations and foregrounding of language features. Now look at these examples of deviancy. Let him Easter, the just man, justices, the achieve of the mastery of the thing. Easter is never used as a verb in English language. Likewise, justice is always a noun. Achieve is used here as a noun, not as a verb, which is completely unusual. So as you see, deviancy is when you manipulate words or sentences to be put in such a way that may seem to be grammatically incorrect, but the focus or the target here is to attract attention. In fact, deviancy is the mother of literature, and it sets apart literature from the norms of the ordinary language. In fact, in literary studies and stylistics, deviancy is the linguistic strategy of calling attention to certain language features in order to shift the reader's attention from what is said to how it is said. This is why in literature will always betray your expectations, because you always would find the unexpected. Okay, so thus the way new ideas introduced captures the mind of the readers and triggers his attention every time such foregrounding or deviant forms of language used. So, by violating the normal lexical conventions of English, these deviations are foregrounded and thus made prominent and dominant, and suggesting new meanings and intruding the dimensions of interpretations. So it helps to evoke the feelings of the reader once a reader encounters an unfamiliar text. In fact, special areas in the mind which is responsible for affect is intensified. It must be pointed out that deviant vocabulary is different from neologisms because neologisms are completely newly invented words, while deviant vocabulary describes the use of existing words in an unusual way, just like the previous examples we saw. Now, phonology is the last level of stylistic analysis that we are doing today. Of course, it entails many features, and we will be expanding on each features with some supporting examples. Sounds are of a very special significance in literary language. Of course, poetry stands out among other literary genres in the vital distinguished role of sound pattern, but narratives also and the other remaining genres of literature have remarkable phonological features, but to a lesser extent than in poetry. Here are some of the most important and recurrent prosodic and sound features of literary language. It goes without saying that phonology is a vital tool of aesthetics in literary language. Sound devices are literary elements used in both rhyme or rhyming, also referred as rhyme with the RIME. It is the agreement of the final group of sounds of the last words of lines of verse in particular. So a rhyme is basically, or simply put, the repetition of similar sounds, usually exactly the same sound, in the final stressed syllables and any following syllables of two or more words. Okay, now as the example here illustrates, there was an old woman, and what do you think? She lived upon nothing but victuals and drink. Victuals and drink were all her diet, and yet this old woman would never be quiet. So you see here, now this is the use of rhyming. We have exactly the same final group of sounds in the two first lines. That's why we label them as A. And for the two last lines, we have exactly the same similar sounds, and this is why we label them as B. Alliteration is the first sound device that we will look at. Successive words starting with the same sound are described as alliterative. Alliteration simply is the repetition of consonant sounds in the same line in the beginning of the words. It is very commonplace among all types of literature, and it adds to the rhythm and the beauty of language. There are actually many or dozens of examples in Dickens' passage. I have cited 3 examples here. Serpents of smoke. So serpents, these two words, serpents and smoke, they are in the same line, and both of them begin with the same sound. Serpents of smoke. Melancholy, madness as well. These two successive words starting with the same sound M. small street still. Now these three successive words begin with exactly the same sound, small street still. So as you can see, the use of alliteration deepens the beauty of the language and adds great deal to the peculiarity of literary language. Another common device is consonance. Consonance is the identification of the last sound of successive words, and so it refers to the repetition of final consonant sounds, such as, for example, in Peter Patter. Okay, so in Peter Patter, for example, the final words have the same sound R. So the use of consonants adds or gives the rhythm of the language a stronger boost. This is example from Dickens' text, religious persuasions. All right, and the last final sound of these two successive words. A pious warehouse. A pious warehouse. Now these two successive words end up with the same sound. One more sound device is assonance. Assonance is the agreement of the middle vowel sounds of consecutive words, or the repetition of vowel sounds in the same line. For example, greater taint. We have the sound A, greater taint. Or painted face. We have the same sound, the A sound, painted face. Or black canal, the sound A. The use of assonance or this sound device makes the language harmonious, consistent, compatible, and really rhythmic.